everybody, it's Jennifer and welcome back to my channel. I know this is a day late and I apologize. This is the next installment of Anne of Green Gables, and we left off in the middle of chapter 23 where she is kind of having a little dare from a classmate. Um, So I will start where we left off. I don't think it's such a very wonderful thing to walk a little low, broad fence, she said. I knew a girl in Marysville who would walk the ridgepole of a roof. I don't believe it, said Josie flatly. I don't believe anybody could walk a ridgepole. You couldn't, anyhow. Couldn't I? Cried Anne rashly. Then I dare you to do it, said Josie defiantly. I dare you to climb up there and walk the ridgepole of Mr. Barry's kitchen roof. Anne turned pale, but there was clearly one thing to be done. She walked toward the house where a ladder was leaning against the kitchen roof. All the fifth-class girls said, "Oh," partly in excitement, partly in dismay. "Don't you do it, Anne," entreated Dinah. "You'll fall off and be killed. Never mind Josie Pye. It isn't fair to dare anybody to do anything so dangerous." "I must do it. My honor is at stake," said Anne solemnly. "I shall walk that ridgepole, Dinah, or perish in the attempt. If I am killed, you are to have my pearl bead ring." Anne climbed the ladder amid breathless silence, gained the ridgepole, balanced herself uprightly on that precarious footing, and started to walk along it, dizzily conscious that she was uncomfortably high up in the world, and that walking ridgepoles was not a thing in which your imagination helped you out much. Nevertheless, she managed to take several steps before the catastrophe came. Then she swayed, lost her balance, and stumbled, staggered, and fell, sliding down over the sun-baked roof and crashing off it through the tangle of Virginia creeper beneath, all before the dismayed circle below could give a simultaneous terrified shriek. If Anne had tumbled off the roof on the side up which she had ascended, Dinah would probably have fallen heir to the pearl bead ring then and there. Fortunately, she fell on the other side, where the roof extended down over the porch so nearly to the ground that a fall therefrom was a much less serious thing. Nevertheless, when Dinah and the other girls had rushed frantically around the house, except Ruby Gillis, who remained as if rooted to the ground and went into hysterics, they found Anne lying all white and limp among the wreck and ruin of the Virginia creeper. "Anne, are you killed?" shrieked Dinah, throwing herself on her knee beside her friend. "Oh, Anne, dear Anne, speak just one word to me and tell me if you are killed." To the immense relief of all the girls, especially Josie Pye, who in spite of lack of imagination had been seized with horrible visions of a future branded as the girl who was the cause of Anne Shirley's early and tragic death, Anne sat dizzily up and answered uncertainly, "No, Dinah, I'm not killed, but I think I am rendered unconscious." "Where?" sobbed Carrie Sloane. "Oh, where, Anne?" Before Anne could answer, Mrs. Barry appeared on the scene. At the sight of her, Anne tried to scramble to her feet, but sank back down with a sharp little cry of pain. "What's the matter? Where have you hurt yourself?" demanded Mrs. Barry. "My ankle," gasped Anne. "Oh, Dinah, please find your father and ask him to take me home. I know I can never walk there, and I'm sure I couldn't hop so far on one foot when Jane couldn't even hop around the garden." Marilla was out in the orchard picking a panful of summer apples when she saw Mr. Barry coming over the log bridge and up the slope with Mrs. Barry beside him and a whole procession of little girls trailing after him. In his arms he carried Anne, whose head lay limply against his shoulder. At that moment Marilla had a revelation. In the sudden stab of fear that pierced her very heart, she realized that Anne had come to mean to her, or what Anne had come to mean to her. She would have admitted that she liked Anne, nay, that she was very fond of Anne, But now she knew as she hurried wildly down the slope that Anne was dearer to her than anything else on the earth. "Mr. Barry, what has happened to her?" she gasped, more white and shaken than the self-contained, sensible Marilla had been for many years. Anne herself answered, lifting her head. "Don't be very frightened, Marilla. I was walking the ridgepole and I fell off. I expect I have sprained my ankle. But, Marilla, I might have broken my neck. Let us look on the bright side of things." "I might have known you'd go and do something of the sort when I let you go to that party," said Marilla, sharp and shrewish in her very relief. "Bring her in here, Mr. Barry, and lay her on the sofa. Mercy me, the child has gone and fainted." It was quite true. Overcome by the pain of her injury, Anne had one more of her wishes granted to her. She had fainted dead way. Matthew, hastily summoned from the harvest field, was straightway dispatched for the doctor, who in due time came to discover that the injury was more serious than they had supposed. Anne's ankle was broken. That night when Marilla went up to the east gable where a white-faced girl was lying, a plaintive voice greeted her from the bed. "Aren't you very sorry for me, Marilla?" "It was your own fault," said Marilla, twitching down the blind and lighting a lamp. "And that is just why you should be sorry for me," said Anne, "because the thought that it is all my own fault is what makes it so hard. If I could blame it on anybody, I would I would feel so much better. But what would you have done, Marilla, if you had been dared to walk a ridgepole?" "I'd have stayed on good firm ground and let them dare away." "Such absurdity," said Marilla. Anne sighed. "But you have such strength of mind, Marilla. I haven't. I just felt that I couldn't bear Josie Pye's scorn. She would have crowed over me all my life, and I think I have been punished so much that you needn't be very cross with me, Marilla. It is not a bit nice to faint after all, and the doctor hurt me dreadfully when he was setting my ankle. I won't be able to go around for 6 or 7 weeks, and I'll miss the new lady teacher. She won't be new any more by the time I go to school, and Gil and everybody will get ahead of me in class. Oh, I am an afflicted mortal. But I'll try to bear it all bravely, if only you won't be cross with me, Marilla." "There, there, I'm not cross," said Marilla. "You're an unlucky child. There's no doubt about that. But as you say, you'll have the suffering of it. Here and now, try and eat some supper." "Isn't it fortunate I've got such an imagination?" said Anne. "It will help me through splendidly, I expect. What do people who haven't any imagination do when they break their bones, do you suppose, Marilla?" Anne had a good reason to bless her imagination many a time and oft during the tedious 7 weeks that followed. But she was not solely dependent on it. She had many visitors, and not a day passed without one or more of the schoolgirls dropping in to bring her flowers and books and tell her all the happenings in the juvenile world of Avonlea. "Everybody has been so good and kind," Marilla sighed Anne happily on the day that she could first limp across the floor. It isn't very pleasant to be laid up. But there is a bright side to it, Marilla. You'll find out how many friends you have. Why, even Superintendent Bell came to see me, and he's really a very fine man. Not a kindred spirit, of course, but I still like him, and I'm awful sorry I ever criticized his prayers. I believe now he really does mean them, only he has got into the habit of saying them as if he didn't. He could get over that if he'd take a little trouble. I gave him a good broad hint. I told him how hard I tried to make my own little private prayers interesting. He told me all about the time he broke his ankle when he was a boy. It does seem so strange to think Superintendent Bell ever being a boy. Even my imagination has its limits, for I can't imagine that. When I try to imagine him as a boy, I see him with gray whiskers and spectacles just as he looks in Sunday school, only small. Now it's so easy to imagine Mrs. Allen as a little girl. Mrs. Allen has been to see me 14 times. Isn't that something to be proud of, Marilla, when a minister's wife has so many claims on her time? She is such a cheerful person to visit you too, or to have visit you too. She never tells you that it's your own fault. She hopes you'll be a better girl on account of it. Mrs. Lynde always told me that when she came to see me, she said it in a kind of a way that made me feel she might hope I'd be a better girl, but I didn't really believe I would. Even Josie Pye came to see me. I received her as politely as I could, because I think she was sorry she dared me to walk a ridgepole. If I had been killed, she would have had to carry a dark burden of remorse all her life. Dinah has been a faithful friend. She's been over every day to cheer my lonely pillow. But oh, I'll be so glad when I go to school, for I've heard such exciting things about the new teacher. The girls all think she is perfectly sweet. Dinah says she has the loveliest fair, curly hair and such fascinating eyes. She dresses beautifully, and her sleeves puffs are bigger than anybody else's in Avonlea. Every other Friday afternoon, she has rec- recitations, and everybody has to say a piece or take part in a dialogue. Oh, it's just glorious to think of it. Josie Pye says she hates it, but that is just because Josie has such a little imagination. Dinah and Ruby Gillis and Jane Andrews are preparing a dialogue called A Morning Visit for next Friday. And the Friday afternoons they don't have recitations. Miss Stacy takes them all to the woods for a field day. And they study ferns and flowers and birds. And they have physical culture exercises every morning and evening. Mrs. Lynde says she's never heard of such goings on, and it all comes of having a lady teacher. But I think it must be splendid. And I believe I shall find that Miss Stacy is a kindred spirit. There's one thing plain to be seen, Anne, said Marilla, and that is that your fall off the berry roof hasn't injured your tongue at all. Chapter 24. Miss Stacy and her pupils get up a concert. It was October again when Anne was ready to go back to school. A glorious October, all red and gold, with mellow mornings when the valleys were filled with delicate mist, as if the spirit of autumn had poured them in for the sun to drain, amethyst and pearl and silver, rose and smoke blue. The dews were so heavy that the fields glistened like a cloth of silver, and there were such heaps of rustling leaves in the hollows of many-stemmed woods to run crisply through. The birch path was a canopy of yellow, and the ferns were sere and brown all along it. There was a twang in the very air that inspired the hearts of small maidens tripping, unlike snails, swiftly and willing to school, willingly to school, and it was jolly to be back again at the little brown desk beside Dinah, with Ruby Gillis nodding across the aisle, and Carrie Sloane sending up notes, and Julia Bell passing a chew of gum down from the back seat. Anne drew a long breath of happiness as she sharpened her pencil and arranged her picture cards in her desk. Life was certainly very interesting. In the new teacher she found another true helpful friend. Miss Stacy was a bright, sympathetic young woman with a happy gift of winning and holding the affections of her pupils and bringing out the best that was in them mentally and morally. Anne expanded like a flower under this wholesome influence and carried home to the admiring Matthew and the critical Marilla glowing accounts of schoolwork and aims. I love Miss Stacy with my whole heart, Marilla. She is so ladylike, and she has such a sweet voice. When she pronounces my name, I feel instinctively that she's spelling it with an E. We had recitations this afternoon. I just wish you could have been there to hear me recite Mary, Queen of Scots. I just put my whole soul into it. Ruby Gillis told me coming home that the way I said the line, "Now for my father's arms," she said my woman's heart farewell, just made her blood run cold. Well, now you might recite it for me some of these days. Out in the barn, suggested Matthew. Of course I will, said Anne meditatively, but I won't be able to do it so well. I know. It won't be so exciting as it is when you have a whole schoolful before you hanging breathlessly on your words. I know I won't be able to make your blood run cold. Mrs. Lynde said, says it makes her blood run cold to see the boys climbing to the very tops of those big trees on Bell's Hill after Crow's Nest last Friday, said Marilla. I wonder at Miss Stacy for encouraging it. But we wanted a crow's nest for nature study, explained Anne. That was on our field afternoon. Field afternoons are splendid, Marilla, and Miss Stacy explains everything so beautifully. We have to write compositions on our field afternoons, and I write the best ones. It is very vain of you to say so, then. You better let your teacher say it. But she did say it, Marilla, and indeed I'm not vain about it. How can I be when I'm such a dunce at geometry? Although I'm really beginning to see through a little too. Miss Stacy makes it so clear. Still, I'll never be good at it, and I assure you it is a humbling reflection. But I love writing compositions. Mostly Miss Stacy lets us choose our own subjects, but next week we are to write a composition on some remarkable person. It's hard to choose among so many remarkable people who have lived. Mustn't it be splendid to be remarkable and have compositions written about you after you're dead? Oh, I would dearly love to be remarkable. I think when I grow up I will be a trained nurse and go with the Red Crosses to the field of battle as a messenger of mercy. That is, if I don't go out as a foreign missionary. That would be very romantic. But one would have to be very good to be a missionary, and that would be a stumbling block. We have physical culture exercises every day. They make you graceful and promote digestion. Promote fiddlesticks, said Marilla, who honestly thought it was all nonsense. But all the field afternoons and recitation Fridays and physical culture contortions paled before a project which Miss Stacy brought forward in November. This was what the scholars of Avonlea School should get up a concert and hold it in a hall on Christmas night for all the laudable purpose of helping to pay for a schoolhouse flag. The pupils, one and all, taking graciously to this plan. The preparations for a program were begun at once, and of all the excited performers elect, none was so excited as Anne Shirley, who threw herself into the undertaking heart and soul, hampered as she was by Marilla's disapproval. Miss Marilla thought it all rank foolishness. It's just filling your heads up with nonsense and taking time that ought to be put on your lessons, she grumbled. I don't approve of children's getting up concerts and racing about to practices. It makes them vain and forward and fond of gadding. But think of the worthy object, pleaded Anne. A flag will cultivate a spirit of patriotism, Marilla. Fudge! There's a precious little patriotism in the thoughts of any of you. All you want is a good time. Well, when you combine patriotism and fun, isn't it all right? Of course, it's real nice to be getting up a concert. We're going to have 6 choruses, and Dinah is to sing a solo. I'm in 2 dialogues, the Society for the Suppression of Gossip and the Fairy Queen. The boys are going to have a dialogue, too, and I'm to have 2 recitations, Marilla, and I just tremble when I think of it. But it's a nice, thrilly kind of tremble. And we are to have a tableau at the last, Faith, Hope, and Charity. Dinah and Ruby and I are to be in it, all draped in white with flowing hair. I'm to be Hope, with my hands clasped so and my eyes uplifted. I'm going to practice my recitations in the garret. Don't be alarmed if you hear me groaning. I have to groan heart-rendingly in one of them, and it is really hard to get up a good artistic groan, Marilla. Josie Pye is sulky because she didn't get the part she wanted in the dialogue. She wanted to be the fairy queen. That would have been ridiculous, for whoever heard of a fairy queen as fat as Josie? Fairy queens must be slender. Jane Andrews is to be the queen, and I am to be the one of her maids of honor. Josie says she thinks a red-head fairy is just ridiculous as a fat one. But I do not let myself mind what Josie says. I'm to have a wreath of white roses on my hair, and Ruby Gillis is going to lend me her slippers because I haven't any of my own. It's necessary for fairies to have slippers, you know. You couldn't imagine a fairy wearing boots, could you? Especially with copper toes. We are going to decorate the hall with creeping spruce and fir mottos with pink tissue paper roses in them. And we are all to march in 2 by 2 after the audience is seated, while Emma White plays a march on the organ. Oh, Marilla, I know you're not so enthusiastic about it as I am, but don't you hope your little Anne will distinguish herself? All I hope is that you behave yourself. I'll be heartily glad when all this fuss is over and you'll be able to settle down. You are simply good for nothing just now, with your head stuffed full of dialogues and groans and tableaux. As for your tongue, it's a marvel it's not clean worn out. Anne sighed and betook herself to the backyard, over which a young new moon was shining through the leafless poplar boughs from an apple-green western sky, and where Matthew was splitting wood. Anne perched herself on a block and talked the concert over with him, sure of an appreciative and sympathetic listener in this instant at least. "Well, now, I reckon it's going to be a pretty good concert, and I expect you'll do your part fine," he said, smiling down into her eager, vicarious little face. Anne smiled back at him. Those two were the best of friends, and Matthew thanked his stars many a time and oft that he had nothing to do with bringing her up. That was Marilla's exclusive duty. If it had been his, he would have been worried over frequent conflicts between inclination and said duty. As it was, he was free to spoil Anne, Marilla's phrasing, as much as he liked. But it was not such a bad arrangement after all. A little appreciation sometimes does quite as much good as all the conscientious bringing up in the world. Chapter 25. Matthew insists on puffed sleeves. Matthew was having a bad 10 minutes of it. He had come into the kitchen in the twilight of a cold, gray December evening, and had sat down in the woodbox corner to take off his heavy boots, unconscious of the fact that Anne and a bevy of her schoolmates were having a practice of the Fairy Queen in the sitting room. Presently they came trooping through the hall and out into the kitchen, laughing and chattering gaily. They did not see Matthew, who shrank bashfully back into the shadows beyond the woodbox with a boot in one hand and a bootjack in the other, and he watched them shyly for the aforesaid 10 minutes as they put on caps and jackets and talked about the dialogue and the concert. Anne stood among them, bright-eyed and animated as they, but Matthew suddenly became conscious that there was something about her different from her mates. And what worried Matthew was that the difference impressed him as being something that should not exist. Anne had a brighter face, and bigger, starrier eyes, and more delicate features than any other. Even shy and unobservant Matthew had learned to take note of these things. But the difference that disturbed him did not consist in any of these respects. Then in what did it consist? Matthew was haunted by this question long after the girls had gone, arm in arm, down the long, hard, frozen lane, and Anne had betaken herself to her books. He could not refer it to Marilla, who he felt would be quite sure to sniff scornfully and remark that the only difference she saw between Anne and the other girls was that they sometimes kept their tongues quiet, while Anne never did. This, Matthew felt, would be no great help. He had recourse to his pipe that evening to help him study it out, much to Marilla's disgust. After 2 hours of smoking and hard reflection, Matthew arrived at a solution of his problem. Anne was not dressed like the other girls. The more Matthew thought about the matter, the more he was convinced that Anne had never been dressed like the other girls, never since she had come to Green Gables. Marilla kept her clothed in plain, dark dresses, all made after the same unvarying pattern. If Matthew knew there was such a thing as fashion in dress, it was as much as he did. But he was quite sure that Anne's sleeves did not look at all like the sleeves the other girls wore. He recalled the cluster of little girls that he had seen around her that evening, all gay in waists of red and blue and pink and white, and he wondered why Marilla always kept her so plainly and soberly gowned. Of course, it must be all right. Marilla knew best, and Marilla was bringing her up. Probably some wise, inscrutable motive was to be served thereby. But surely it would do no harm to let the child have one pretty dress, something like Donna Barry always wore. Matthew decided that he would give her one. That surely could not be objected to as an unwanted putting off in his oar. Christmas was only a fortnight off. A nice new dress would be the very thing for a present. Matthew, with a sigh of satisfaction, put away his pipe and went to bed, while Marilla opened all the doors and aired the house. The very next evening Matthew betook himself to Carmody to buy the dress, determined to get the worst over and have it done with. It would be, he felt assured, no trifling ordeal. There were some things Matthew could buy and prove himself no meaning bargainer. but he knew he would be at the mercy of shopkeepers when it came to buying a girl's dress. After much cogitation, Matthew resolved to go to Samuel Lawson's store instead of William Blair's. To be sure, the Cuthberts always had gone to William Blair's. It was almost as much a matter of conscience with them as to attend the Presbyterian church and vote Conservative. But William Blair's two daughters frequently waited on customers there, and Matthew held them in absolute dread. He could contrive to deal with them when he knew exactly what he wanted and could point it out. But in such a matter of this, requiring an explanation and consultation, Matthew felt that he must be sure of a man behind the counter. So he would go to Lawson's, where Samuel or his son would wait on him. Alas, Matthew did not know that Samuel, in the recent expansion of his business, had set up a lady clerk also. She was a niece of his wife's, and a very dashing young person indeed, with a huge drooping pompadour, big rolling brown eyes, and the most expensive bewildering smile. She was dressed with exceeding smartness and wore several bangle bracelets that glittered and rattled and tinkled with every movement of her hands. Matthew was covered with confusion at finding her there at all, and those bangles completely wrecked his wits at one fell swoop. "What can I do for you this evening, Mr. Cuthbert?" Miss Lucilla Harris inquired briskly, integratingly, tapping the counter with both hands. "Have you any, any, well now, say any garden rakes?" stammered Matthew. Mrs. Harris looked somewhat surprised, as well she might, to hear a man inquiring for garden rakes in the middle of December. "I believe we have one or two left over," she said, "but they're upstairs in the lumber room. I'll go and see." During her absence, Matthew collected his scattered senses for another effort. When Miss Harris returned with the rake and cheerfully inquired, "Anything else tonight, Mr. Cuthbert?" Matthew took his courage in both hands and replied, "Well, now, since you suggest it, I might as well that is, look at, buy some hayseed." Miss Harris had heard Matthew Cuthbert called odd. She now concluded that he was entirely crazy. "We only keep hayseed in the spring," she explained loftily. "We've none on hand just now." "Oh, certainly, certainly, just as you say," stammered unhappy Matthew, seizing the rake and making for the door. At the threshold he recollected that he had not paid for it, and he turned miserably black. While Miss Harris was counting out his change, he rallied his powers for a final, desperate attempt. "Well, now, if it isn't too much trouble, I might as well, that is, I'd like to look at some sugar." "White or brown?" inquired Miss Harris patiently. "Oh, well now, brown," said Matthew feebly. "There's a barrel over there," said Miss Harris, shaking her bangles at it. "It's the only kind we have." "I'll take 20 pounds of it," said Matthew, with the beads of perspiration standing on his forehead. Matthew had driven halfway home before he was his own man again. It had been a gruesome experience, but it served him right, he thought, for committing the heresy of going to a strange store. When he reached home, he hid the rake in the tool house, but the sugar he carried into Marilla. "Brown sugar!" exclaimed Marilla. "Whatever possessed you to get so much? You know I never use it except for the hired man's porridge or black fruit cake. Jerry's gone, and I've made my cake long ago. It's not good sugar either. It's coarse and dark. William Blair doesn't usually keep sugar like that." "I thought it might come in handy sometimes," said Matthew, making good his escape. When Matthew came to think the matter over, he decided that a woman was required to cope with the situation. Marilla was out of the question, and Matthew felt sure he could throw cold water on his project at once. Remained only Mrs. Lynde, for of no other woman in Avonlea would Matthew have dared to ask advice. To Mrs. Lynde he went accordingly, and that good lady promptly took the matter out of the harassed man's hand. "Pick out a dress for you to give Anne?" "To be sure I will. I'm going to Carmody tomorrow, and I'll attend to it. Have you something particular in mind?" "No. Well, I'll just go by my own judgment then. I believe a nice rich brown would suit Anne. And William Blair has some new Gloria, and that's very pretty. Perhaps you'd like me to make it up for her, too, seeing that if Marilla was to make it, Anne would probably get wind of it before the time it spoiled the surprise. Well, I'll do it. No, it isn't a mite of trouble. I like sewing, and I'll make it to fit my niece, Jenny Gillis, for she and Anne are as like as two peas as far as figure goes. Well, now, I'm much obliged, said Matthew, and and I don't know, but I think they make the sleeves different nowadays to what they used to be. If it wouldn't be too much asking too much, I'd like them made in a new way. Puffs, of course. You needn't worry a speck more about it, Matthew. I'll make it up in the very latest fashion, said Mrs. Lynde. To herself, she added when Matthew had gone, it'll be a real satisfaction to see that poor girl wear something different for once. The way Marilla dresses her is positively ridiculous. That's what. And I have ached to tell her so plainly a dozen times. I've held my tongue, though, for I can see Marilla doesn't want advice. She thinks she knows more about bringing children up than I do, for all she's an old maid. But that's always the way. Folks that has brought up children know there's no hard and fast method in the world that'll suit every child. But them as never have think it's all as plain and as easy as Rule 3. Just set your 3 terms down so fashion, and the sum'll work out correct. But flesh and blood don't come under the head of arithmetic, and that's where Marilla Cuthbert makes her mistake. I suppose she's trying to cultivate a spirit of humility in Anne by dressing her as she does, but is more likely to cultivate envy and discontent. I'm sure the child must feel the difference between her clothes and the other girls. And to think of Matthew taking notice of it. That man is waking up after being asleep for 60 years. Marilla knew all the following fortnight that Matthew had something on his mind, but what it was she could not guess until Christmas Eve when Mrs. Lynde brought up the new dress. Marilla behaved pretty well on the whole, although it was very likely she distrusted Mrs. Lynde's diplomatic explanation that she had made the dress because Matthew was afraid Anne would find out about it too soon if Marilla made it. So this is what Matthew has been looking so mysterious over and grinning about to himself for 2 weeks, is it? She said a little stiffly but tolerantly. I know he was up to some foolishness. Well, I must say, I don't think Anne needed any more dresses. I made her 3 good, warm, serviceable ones this fall, and anything more is sheer extravagance. There's enough material in these sleeves alone to make a waist. I declare there is. You'll just pamper Anne's vanity, Matthew, and she's as vain as a peacock now. Well, I hope she'll be satisfied at last, for I know she's been hankering after those silly sleeves ever since they came in, although she's never said a word after the first. The puffs have been getting bigger and more ridiculous right along. They're as big as balloons now. Next year, anybody who wears them will have to go through a door sideways. Christmas morning broke on a beautiful white world. It had been a very mild December, and, people had looked forward to a green Christmas. But just enough snow fell softly in the night to transfigure Avonlea. Anne peeped out from her frosted gable window with delighted eyes. The firs in the haunted wood were all feathery and wonderful. The birches and wild cherry trees were outlined in pearl. The plowed fields were stretches of snowy dimples, and there was a crisp tang in the air that was glorious. Anne ran downstairs singing until her voice re-echoed through Green Gables. Merry Christmas, Marilla. Merry Christmas, Matthew. Isn't it a lovely Christmas? I'm so glad it's white. Any other kind of Christmas doesn't seem real, does it? I don't like green Christmases. They are not green. They are just nasty fade browns and grays. What makes people call them green? Why, Matthew? Is that for me? Oh, Matthew! Matthew had sheepishly unfolded the dress from its paper swathings and held it out with a deprecatory glance at Marilla, who feigned to be contemptuously filling the teapot, but nevertheless watched the scene out of the corner of her eye with a rather interested air. Anne took the dress and looked at it in reverent silence. Oh, how pretty it was! A soft, brown gloria with all the gloss of silk, a skirt with dainty frills and shirrings, a waist elaborately pin-tucked in the most fashionable way with a little ruffle of filmy lace at the neck. But the sleeves, they were the crowning glory. Long elbow cuffs, and above them two beautiful puffs divided by rows of shirring and bows of brown silk ribbon. "That's a Christmas present for you, Anne," said Matthew shyly. "Why, why, Anne, don't you like it?" "Well, now, well, now," for Anne's eyes suddenly filled with tears. "Like it? Oh, Matthew!" Anne laid the dress over a chair and clasped her hands. "Matthew, it's perfectly exquisite. Oh, I can never thank you enough. Look at those sleeves. Oh, it seems to me this must be a happy dream." "Well, well, let us have breakfast," interrupted Marilla. "I must say, Anne, I don't think you needed the dress, but since Matthew has got it for you, see that you take good care of it. There's a hair ribbon, Mrs. Lynde, that's for you. It's brown to match the dress. Come now, sit in." "I don't see how I'm going to eat breakfast," said Anne rapturously. "Breakfast seems to be a commonplace at such an exciting moment. I'd rather feast my eyes on that dress. I'm so glad that puff sleeves are still fashionable. It did seem to me that I'd never get over it if they went out before I had a dress with them. I have never felt quite satisfied, you see. It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give me the ribbon, too. I feel that I ought to be a very good girl indeed. It's at times like this I'm sorry I'm not a model little girl, and I always resolve that I will be in the future. But somehow it's hard to carry out your resolutions when irresistible temptations come. Still, I really will make an extra effort after this." When the commonplace breakfast was over, Dinah appeared, crossing the white log bridge in the hollow, a gay little figure in her crimson ulster. Anne flew down the slope to meet her. "Merry Christmas, Dinah! And oh, it's a wonderful Christmas! I have something splendid to show you. Matthew has given me the loveliest dress with such sleeves. I couldn't even imagine any nicer." "I got something more for you," said Dinah breathlessly. "Here, this box. Aunt Josephine sent us out a big box with ever so many things in it, and this is for you. I'd have brought it over last night, but it didn't come till after dark, and I never feel very comfortable coming through the haunted wood in the dark now." Anne opened the box and peeped in. First a card with "For the Anne girl" and "Merry Christmas" written on it, and then a pair of the daintiest little kid slippers, with beaded toes and satin bows and glistening buckles. "Oh," said Anne, "Dinah, this is too much. I must be dreaming." "I call it providential," said Dinah. "You won't have to borrow Ruby's slippers now, and that's a blessing, for they are 2 sizes too big for you, and it would be awful to hear a fairy shuffling. Josie Pye would be delighted, mind you. Rob Wright went home with Gertie Pye from practice the night before last. Did you ever hear anything equal to that?" All the Avonlea scholars were in a fever of excitement that day, for the hall had to be decorated and a last grand rehearsal held. The concert came off in the evening and was pronounced a success. The little hall was crowded. All the performers did excellently well, but Anne was the brightest particular star of the occasion, as even envy, in the shape of Josie Pye, dared not deny. "Oh, hasn't it been a brilliant evening?" sighed Anne when it was all over, and she and Dinah were walking home together under a dark, starry night. "Everything went off very well," said Dinah practically. "I guess we must have made as much as $10. Mind you, Mr. Allen is going to send an account of it to the Charlottetown paper." "Oh, Dinah, will we really see our names in print? It makes me thrill to think of it." "Your solo was perfectly elegant, Dinah. I felt prouder than you did when it was encored. I just said to myself, 'It is my dear bosom friend who is so honored.'" "Well, your recitations just brought down the house, Anne. That sad one was simply splendid." "Oh, I was so nervous, Dinah, when Mr. Allen called out my name. I really cannot tell how I ever got up on that platform. I felt as if a million eyes were looking for me and through me, and for one dreadful moment I was sure I couldn't begin at all. Then I thought of my lovely puff sleeves and took courage. I knew that I must live up to those sleeves, Dinah, so I started in, and my voice seemed to be coming from ever so far away. I just felt like a parrot. It's providential that I practiced those resuscitations so often up in the garret, or I'd never been able to get through. Did I groan all right? Yes, indeed. You groaned lovely, assured Dinah. I saw old Mrs. Sloane wiping away tears when I sat down. It was splendid to think I've touched somebody's heart. It's so romantic to take part in a concert, isn't it? Oh, it's been a very memorable occasion indeed. Wasn't the boys' dialogue fine? Said Dinah. Gilbert Blythe was just splendid. And I do think it's awful mean the way you treat Gil. Wait till I tell you. When you ran off the platform after the fairy dialogue, one of your roses fell out of your hair. I saw Gil pick it up and put it in his breast pocket. There now, you're so romantic that I'm sure you ought to be pleased at that. It's nothing to me what that person does, said Anne loftily. I simply never waste a thought on him, Dinah. That night Marilla and Matthew, who had been out to a concert for the first time in 20 years, sat for a while by the kitchen fire after Anne had gone to bed. Well, now I guess our Anne did as well as any of them, said Matthew proudly. Yes, she did, admitted Marilla. She's a bright child, Matthew, and she looked real nice, too. I've been kind of opposed to this concert scheme, but I suppose there's no real harm in it after all. Anyhow, I was proud of Anne tonight, although I'm not going to tell her so. Well, now, I was proud of her, and I did tell her, so before she went upstairs, said Matthew. We must see what we can do for her some of these days, Marilla. I guess she'll need something more than Avonlea school by and by. There's time enough to think of that, said Marilla. She's only 13 in March, though tonight it struck me she was growing quite a big girl. Mrs. Lynde made that dress a mite too long, and it makes Anne look so tall. She's quick to learn, and I guess the best thing we can do for her will be to send her to Queen's after a spell. But nothing need be said about that for a year or two yet. Well, now, it will do no harm to be thinking it over off and on, said Matthew. Things like that are all the better for lots of thinking over. Chapter 26. The Story Club is formed. Junior Avonlea had found it hard to settle down in a humdrum existence again. To Anne in particular, things seemed fearfully flat, stale, and unprofitable after the goblet of excitement she had been sipping for weeks. Could she go back to the former quiet pleasures of those faraway days before the concert? At first, as she told Dinah, she did not really think she could. I'm positive certain, Dinah, that life can never be quite the same. Now I've lost my place. Again, as it was in those olden days, she said mournfully, as if referring to a period of at least 50 years back. Perhaps after a while I'll get used to it, but I'm afraid concerts spoil people for everyday life. I suppose that's why Marilla disapproves of them. Marilla is such a sensible woman. It must be a great deal better to be sensible, but still I don't believe I'd really want to be a sensible person because they are so unromantic. Mrs. Lynde says there's no danger of my ever being one, but you can never tell. I feel just now that I may grow up to be sensible yet. But perhaps that is only because I'm tired. I simply couldn't sleep last night for ever so long. I just lay awake and imagined the concert over and over again. That's one splendid thing about such affairs. It's so lovely to look back to them. Eventually, however, Avonlea School slipped back into its old groove and took up its old interests. To be sure, the concert left traces. Ruby Gillis and Emma White, who had crawled over a point of precedence in their platform seats, no longer sat at the same desk, and a promising friendship of 3 years was broken up. Josie Pye and Julia Bell did not speak for 3 months because Josie Pye had told Bessie Wright that Julia Bell's bow, when she got up to recite, made her think of a chicken jerking its head. And Bessie told Julia none of the Sloanes would have any dealings with the Bells because the Bells had declared that the Sloanes had too much to do in the program, and the Sloanes had retorted that the Bells were not capable of doing the little they had to do properly. Finally, Charlie Sloane fought Moody Spurgeon McPherson because Moody Spurgeon had said that Anne Shirley put on airs about her resuscitations and Moody was licked. Consequently, Moody's sister Ella May would not speak to Anne Shirley all the rest of the winter. With the exception of these trifling frictions, work in Miss Stacy's little kingdom went on with regularity and smoothness. The winter weeks slipped by. It was an unusually mild winter with so little snow that Anne and Dinah could go to school nearly every day by way of the birch path. On Anne's birthday, they were tripping lightly down it, keeping eyes and ears alert amid all their chatter, for Miss Stacy had told them that they must soon write a composition on a winter's walk in the woods, and it behooved them to be observant. "Just think, Dinah, I'm 13 years old today," remarked Anne in an awed voice. "I can scarcely realize that I'm in my teens. When I woke this morning, it seemed to me that everything must be different. You've been 13 for a month, so I suppose it doesn't seem such a novelty to you as it does to me. It makes life seem so much more interesting. In 2 more years, I'll really be grown up. It's a great comfort to think that I'll be able to use big words then without being laughed at." "Ruby Gillis says she means to have a beau as soon as she's 15, said Dinah. "Ruby Gillis thinks of nothing but beaux," said Anne disdainfully. "She actually delighted when anyone writes her name up and take notice, for all she pretends to be so mad. But I'm afraid that is an uncharitable speech. Mrs. Allen says that we should never make uncharitable speeches, but they do slip out so often before you think, don't they? I simply can't talk about Josie Pye without making an uncharitable speech, so I never mention her at all. You may have noticed that. I'm trying to be as much like Mrs. Allen as I possibly can, for I think she's perfect. Mr. Allen thinks so too. Mrs. Lynde says he just worships the ground she treads on, and she doesn't really think it's right for a minister to set his affections so much on a mortal being. But then, Dinah, even ministers are human and have their besetting sins just like everybody else. I've had such an interesting talk with Mrs. Allen about besetting sins last Saturday afternoon. There's just a few things that's proper to talk about on Sundays, and that is one of them. My besetting sin is imagining too much and forgetting my duties. I'm striving very hard to overcome it, and now that I'm really 13, perhaps I'll get on better. In 4 more years, we'll be able to put our hair up, said Dinah. Alice Bell is only 16, and she's wearing hers up, but I think that's ridiculous. I shall wait until I'm 17. If I had Alice Bell's crooked nose, said Anne decidedly, I wouldn't. But there, I won't say what I was going to say, because it was extremely uncharitable. Besides, I was comparing it with my own nose, and that's vanity. I'm afraid I think too much about my nose ever since I heard that compliment about it long ago. It really is a great comfort to me. Oh, Dinah, look, there's a rabbit. There's something to remember for our woods composition. I really think the woods are just as lovely in winter as in summer. They are so white and still, as if they're asleep and dreaming pretty dreams. I won't mind writing that composition when the time comes," sighed Dinah. "I can manage to write about the words, but the one we're to hand in on Monday is terrible. The idea of Miss Stacy telling us to write a story out of our own heads. Why, it's easy as wink," said Anne. "It's easy for you because you have an imagination," retorted Dinah. "But what would you do if you had been born without one? I suppose you have your composition all done?" Anne nodded, trying hard not to look virtuously complacent and failing miserably. "I wrote it last Monday evening. It's called The Jealous Rival, or In Death Not Divided. I read it to Marilla, and she said it was stuff and nonsense. Then I read it to Matthew, and he said it was fine. That is the kind of critic I like. It's a sad, sweet story. I just cried like a child while I was writing it. It's about two beautiful maidens called Cordelia Montsary and Geraldine Seymour, who lived in the same village and were devotedly attached to each other. Cordelia was a regal brunette with a coronet of midnight hair and duskly flashing eyes. Geraldine was a queenly blonde with her hair spun like gold and velvetly purple eyes. I never saw anybody with purple eyes, said Dinah dubiously. Neither did I. I just imagined them. I wanted something out of the common, and Geraldine had an alabaster brow, too. I found what an alabaster brow is. That is one of the advantages of being 13. You know so much more than you did when you were only 12. Well, what became of Cordelia and Geraldine? Asked Dinah, who was beginning to feel rather interested in their fate. They grew in beauty side by side until they were 16. Then Bertram DeVere came to their native village and fell in love with the fair Geraldine. He saved her life when her horse ran away with her in a carriage, and she fainted in his arms, and he carried her home 3 miles because, you understand, the carriage was all smashed up. I found it rather hard to imagine the proposal because I had no experience to go by. I asked Ruby Gillis if she knew anything about how men propose because I thought she'd be like an authority on the subject, having so many sisters married. Ruby told me she was hid in the hall pantry when Malcolm Andres proposed to her sister Susan. She said Malcolm told Susan that his dad had given him the farm in his own name and then said, "What do you say, darling pet, if we get hitched this fall?" And that's it for this one, guys. And next week we'll have more. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time. God bless.